The snow was stained with her blood when she collapsed against the pine tree, lungs burning from the cold air and the desperate flight through the winter wilderness of northern Utah. Teresa Anderson pressed her trembling hand against her ribs where her husband had struck her one final time before she managed to escape into the January night. The year was 1882, and she had married Vincent Anderson 3 years ago in Salt Lake City, believing his promises of a prosperous life. Instead, she had found herself trapped in a nightmare of violence and cruelty that had only grown worse with each passing season. Her fingers were numb despite the thin gloves she wore, and her dress offered little protection against the bitter wind that howled through the mountains. She had fled their homestead 20 miles south of Kelton just after midnight, when Vincent had finally passed out from whiskey. The bruises covering her arms and the fresh cut above her eye were nothing compared to the terror that had driven her into the frozen darkness. This time, she knew with absolute certainty that if she stayed, he would kill her. Teresa tried to stand, but her legs buckled beneath her. The world spun, and she sank deeper into the snow, watching her breath form white clouds in the moonlight. She had no destination, no plan beyond getting as far from Vincent as possible. The cold was starting to feel almost comfortable now, a dangerous warmth spreading through her limbs that she dimly recognized as the beginning of the end. The sound of hoofbeats reached her through the haze of exhaustion. Teresa's heart seized with panic. Vincent had found her. She tried to crawl deeper into the trees, but her body refused to obey. The horse drew closer, and she could hear the creak of leather and the jingle of spurs. She closed her eyes, preparing for the inevitable rage that would follow. Jesus Christ. The voice was deep and unfamiliar, filled with genuine shock rather than anger. "Madam, madam, can you hear me?" Teresa forced her eyes open to see a man dismounting from a large bay horse. He was tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a heavy sheepskin coat and a wide-brimmed hat covered in snow. His face was shadowed in the moonlight, but she could see the concern etched in his features as he knelt beside her. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible, "don't send me back." The cowboy pulled off his gloves and gently touched her face, checking for fever. His hands were warm and surprisingly gentle. "Send you back where?" "Never mind, we need to get you warm first. I've got a cabin about a mile from here. Can you ride?" Teresa shook her head. She could barely keep her eyes open. The man muttered something under his breath and stood, returning a moment later with a thick blanket from his saddle. He wrapped it around her carefully, avoiding the worst of her visible injuries. "This is going to hurt, and I'm real sorry about that," he said softly. "But if I don't get you out of this cold, you won't last the hour." He lifted her as though she weighed nothing at all, and despite the pain that lanced through her ribs, Teresa felt safer than she had in 3 years. The cowboy settled her in front of him on the saddle, keeping one strong arm around her waist to hold her steady while he took up the reins with the other hand. "Name's Dalton Drake," he said as the horse began moving through the snow. "I work as a ranch hand for the Diamond Creek outfit, but I've got my own place up in these hills. You don't have to tell me anything you don't want to, but I need to know one thing. Is someone coming after you, my husband?" Teresa managed to say through chattering teeth. "Vincent Anderson. He will come looking for me." She felt Dalton's body tense behind her, his arm tightening protectively. "He do this to you, the bruises and the cut?" "Yes." There was a long moment of silence broken only by the steady rhythm of the horse's hooves through the snow. When Dalton finally spoke, his voice was hard as iron. "He'll never hurt you again. That's a promise." The simple certainty in those words broke something loose in Teresa's chest, and she found herself crying for the first time since her wedding day. She had been so focused on survival, on enduring each day and night, that she had forgotten what it felt like to have someone care whether she lived or died. The cabin appeared through the trees like a miracle. It was small but well built, with smoke rising from the chimney indicating a fire still burned inside. Dalton dismounted and lifted Teresa down carefully, then kicked the door open and carried her inside. The warmth hit her like a physical force, making her gasp. He set her down in a chair near the stone fireplace and immediately began stoking the fire, adding more wood until the flames roared. Then he brought more blankets and wrapped them around her shoulders before crouching down to remove her snow-soaked boots. "I'm going to stable my horse," Dalton said, looking up at her with eyes that she could now see were a striking blue-gray. "Then I'll make you something hot to drink and we'll take a look at those injuries. Will you be all right for a few minutes?" Teresa nodded, unable to form words. She watched him leave, half convinced this was a fever dream and she would wake up back in Vincent's house with his hands around her throat. But the warmth of the fire was real, and when Dalton returned a few minutes later stamping snow from his boots, he was solid and present. He filled a kettle and hung it over the fire, then pulled up another chair and sat down across from her. In the firelight, she could see him clearly for the first time. He was perhaps 30 years old, with dark brown hair that curled slightly at his collar and strong, honest features weathered by years of outdoor work. There was a scar along his jawline and his hands were calloused from hard labor, but his eyes were kind. "I'm Teresa," she said quietly. "Teresa Anderson, though I wish I could take back that last name." "Well, Teresa, you're safe here. I meant what I said out there. Your husband won't lay another hand on you." Dalton leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees. "How long have you been running?" "I left our homestead maybe 4 or 5 hours ago. I don't really know. I just walked until I couldn't walk anymore." She looked down at her hands, at the wedding ring that had become a shackle. "He was drinking tonight worse than usual. He said things, did things. I knew if I didn't leave I would die." Dalton's jaw tightened, but his voice remained gentle. "You're brave. A lot of women wouldn't have had the strength to run." "I'm not brave," Teresa said bitterly. "I'm terrified. Even now, sitting here, I keep waiting for him to break down that door." The kettle began to whistle, and Dalton stood to prepare tea. He brought her a steaming cup, and she wrapped her frozen fingers around it gratefully. The warmth began to seep back into her body, though the aches and pains of her injuries were becoming more pronounced as the numbness faded. "Let me see that cut above your eye," Dalton said, pulling his chair closer. He had brought a clean cloth and a basin of water. "This might sting." He cleaned the wound with careful, practiced movements, and Teresa found herself studying his face. There was a quiet strength about him, a steadiness that was the complete opposite of Vincent's volatile rage. When Dalton's fingers brushed her temple, she flinched instinctively, and he immediately pulled back. "I won't hurt you," he said softly. "I swear it." "I know," Teresa whispered, though her body's reactions were beyond her control. "I'm sorry, it's just habit. Don't apologize, you've got nothing to be sorry for." Dalton finished cleaning the cut and sat back. "You should rest now. You can take the bed. I'll sleep out here by the fire." "I can't take your bed," Teresa protested. "Yes, you can and you will. You need proper rest and warmth." Dalton stood and gestured toward the small bedroom visible through an open doorway. "Go on now. We'll figure out what comes next in the morning." Teresa rose shakily to her feet, still wrapped in the blankets. At the doorway to the bedroom, she turned back. "Why are you helping me? You don't know me." Dalton met her eyes steadily. "Because it's the right thing to do, and because no one deserves what you've been through." The bed was simple but comfortable, with thick quilts that smelled faintly of pine and wood smoke. Teresa lay down fully clothed, unable to remember the last time she had felt safe enough to truly sleep. Despite her exhaustion, She found herself listening for sounds from the main room, reassured by the occasional crackle of the fire and Dalton's quiet movements. She woke once in the night, disoriented and afraid, but then she heard Dalton's steady breathing from the other room and remembered where she was. The terror that had been her constant companion for 3 years eased just slightly, and she slipped back into sleep. Morning brought the smell of coffee and frying bacon. Teresa sat up slowly, cataloging her injuries. Her ribs ached with every breath and the bruises had darkened to deep purple overnight. But she was alive, and she was away from Vincent. For now, that was enough. She emerged from the bedroom to find Dalton cooking breakfast at the small stove. He glanced over his shoulder and gave her a slight smile. "Morning, how are you feeling?" "Sore," Teresa admitted, "but better than last night. Sit down, food will help." Dalton brought her a plate of bacon, eggs, and biscuits along with a fresh cup of coffee. The simple kindness of the gesture made her throat tighten with emotion. They ate in comfortable silence for a while before Dalton set down his fork and looked at her seriously. "We need to talk about what happens next. Your husband will be looking for you by now, and Kelton isn't that far from here. Does he know about this cabin?" "I don't think so. Vincent didn't have much to do with the ranching community. He kept to himself mostly, except when he went into town for whiskey." Teresa set down her own fork, her appetite fading. "But he'll search everywhere. He thinks I'm his property." "The law won't help you?" Dalton asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "The law says a man has the right to discipline his wife as he sees fit, and Vincent is very good at making his violence seem justified." Teresa wrapped her hands around her coffee cup. "I have nowhere to go. No family, no money of my own. I took nothing but the clothes on my back." Dalton was quiet for a long moment, his expression thoughtful. "You could stay here." Teresa looked up sharply. "What? Stay here? At least until we figure out something better. I'm gone most days working at the Diamond Creek Ranch, but this cabin is solid and warm. You'd be safe." He held up a hand when she started to protest. "I know how it sounds, but I'm offering you shelter, nothing more. You can have the bedroom, I'll sleep out here, and your reputation will be your own business." "Why would you do this? You don't owe me anything." "Maybe not, but I can't in good conscience send you back out there knowing what's waiting for you." Dalton's eyes were earnest. "Truth is, I've seen too many women suffer at the hands of cruel men. My own mother endured it before she finally left my father when I was 16. She died 2 years later, and I've always wondered if things might have been different if someone had helped her sooner." Teresa felt tears prick her eyes. "I don't know what to say." "Say yes, at least for now." Dalton reached across the table and gently touched her hand. "Let me help you, Teresa. You deserve a chance at a life without fear." "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, thank you." The next few days fell into a pattern. Dalton would leave before dawn to work at the Diamond Creek Ranch, which was about 5 miles east through the mountains. Teresa would spend the days resting and healing, grateful for the solitude and safety. In the evenings, Dalton would return and they would share dinner, gradually learning about each other through careful conversation. Teresa discovered that Dalton had been born in Texas, but came north after his mother died, looking for a fresh start. He was a skilled horseman and cattleman, respected by the other ranch hands despite his preference for solitude. He had built this cabin himself 3 years ago, planning to eventually start his own small ranch once he saved enough money. In turn, Dalton learned that Teresa had been raised in an orphanage in Salt Lake City, which was why she had no family to turn to. She had met Vincent at a church social when she was 19, and he had courted her with apparent kindness until the wedding night when his true nature emerged. She had once dreamed of being a teacher, but Vincent had forbidden her from pursuing any interests outside their home. On the 4th day, a heavy snowstorm rolled through, trapping them both in the cabin. Dalton couldn't make it to the ranch, so instead he spent the day doing small repairs and maintenance while Teresa worked on mending his shirts, which she had noticed were in poor condition. It felt strange and comfortable at once, this domestic companionship with a man who treated her with respect. "You don't have to do that," Dalton said, watching her sew. "I want to. You've done so much for me. It's the least I can offer." Teresa tied off a thread and reached for another shirt. "Besides, I like having something useful to do. Did your husband not let you keep busy?" "Vincent wanted me available for his needs at all times. He said women who kept themselves too occupied got ideas above their station." The bitterness in her voice was sharp. "I wasn't allowed to read, to have friends, to do anything without his explicit permission." Dalton's hand stilled on the piece of wood he was sanding. "That's not a marriage. That's imprisonment." "I know that now. I didn't realize it at first, or maybe I did, but I didn't think I had any choice." Teresa looked up at him. "How did your mother finally leave your father?" "She waited until he was away on a cattle drive. Then she packed what little we had and we took a train as far as our money would go. We ended up in a small town in New Mexico where she worked as a seamstress. It wasn't an easy life, but she was happier in those 2 years than I ever remember her being before." Dalton set down the wood and moved to sit across from Teresa. "She used to say that freedom, even with hardship, was worth more than comfort in chains. She sounds like a wise woman." "She was. I miss her every day." Dalton's expression was distant with memory. "She made me promise I would never raise my hand to a woman in anger. Said if she couldn't stop the violence she endured, at least she could make sure it ended with her." Teresa felt something shift in her chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. This man, with his quiet strength and gentle hands, was showing her what kindness looked like, what safety felt like. It was intoxicating and terrifying in equal measure. As the storm raged outside, they talked late into the night, sharing stories and dreams. Teresa told him about the books she had loved as a child, sneaking to read by candlelight in the orphanage. Dalton described the wild horses he had seen in Texas, running free across the plains. Without quite knowing how it happened, Teresa found herself laughing for the first time in years, really laughing at one of Dalton's stories about a particularly stubborn calf. The sound of her own laughter startled her into silence. Dalton looked at her with such understanding that she felt stripped bare. "It's good to hear you laugh," he said quietly. "I had forgotten what it felt like," Teresa admitted. That night, lying in Dalton's bed while he slept by the fire, Teresa acknowledged the truth she had been trying to ignore. She was falling in love with her rescuer. It was too soon, too complicated, and she was still legally married to Vincent. But her heart didn't seem to care about any of those practical concerns. A week passed, then two. The winter landscape was harsh and beautiful, and Teresa began to feel stronger. The bruises faded from purple to yellow and finally disappeared. The cut above her eye healed to a thin pink line. More importantly, the constant tension that had lived in her shoulders began to ease. She slept through the nights without nightmares. She could hear a sudden noise without flinching. Dalton continued to be unfailingly respectful, never pushing her or making her feel uncomfortable. But Teresa noticed the way his eyes lingered on her sometimes, the gentle care he took with even the smallest interactions. She noticed the way his presence made her feel safe and valued in a way she had never experienced before. One evening in early February, Dalton came home later than usual, his expression troubled. Teresa felt her newfound peace shatter. "What's wrong?" she asked immediately. Dalton removed his hat and coat slowly, clearly weighing his words. "I heard talk in Kelton today. Your husband has been making noise about his missing wife. He's told anyone who will listen that you've been taken against your will, that he's worried sick about you. Teresa's hand went to her throat. He's laying the groundwork to claim I'm insane or that someone kidnapped me. If he finds me, no one will believe I left willingly. There's more. He's offering a reward for information about your whereabouts. Dalton crossed to her and took her hands in his. Teresa, we need to think about the long term. You can't hide here forever. I know. Teresa forced herself to breathe steadily. But what choice do I have? Divorce is nearly impossible to obtain, and even if I could, Vincent would never let me go. What if he didn't have a choice? Dalton's voice was careful. What if you were already married to someone else? Teresa stared at him. I don't understand. Marry me. The words came out in a rush. I know it's not legal if you're still married to Anderson, but if we present ourselves as husband and wife, it gives us protection. People will be less likely to question your presence here, and it makes it harder for him to claim you against your will. Dalton, I can't ask you to do that. The risk to your reputation, to your life if Vincent finds out. I'm not asking for your permission. I'm offering you a solution. Dalton squeezed her hands gently. And Teresa, I need you to know this isn't just about protecting you. These past few weeks, getting to know you, having you here, it's made me realize how empty my life was before. I care about you, deeply. If there were a way to make this real and proper, I would do it in a heartbeat. Teresa felt tears streaming down her face. I care about you too, so much it frightens me. But you deserve someone without all this complication, someone free to love you openly. I don't want someone else. I want you. Dalton cupped her face gently, giving her every opportunity to pull away. When she didn't, he leaned forward and kissed her softly. It was nothing like Vincent's brutal, possessive kisses. This was tender and questioning, a promise rather than a demand. When they broke apart, Teresa was trembling. Yes, she whispered. Yes, I'll marry you, in whatever way we can. They were married 2 days later by a traveling preacher who happened to be passing through Kelton. Teresa used her maiden name, Ashford, and prayed that the deception would be forgiven given the circumstances. The ceremony was simple, held in the cabin with only the preacher present, but when Dalton slipped a simple gold band on her finger and kissed her, Teresa felt something heal inside her soul. That night, Dalton held her close by the fire, both of them fully clothed but wrapped in each other's arms. We'll take this as slow as you need, he murmured into her hair. I meant what I said. I want you to feel safe with me. I do feel safe, Teresa said, tilting her head to look up at him. For the first time in my life, I feel like I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. They kissed again, and this time there was more heat behind it, though Dalton was careful to follow her lead. Teresa marveled at the difference between this and her experiences with Vincent. There was no pain here, no fear, only a growing desire that she was free to explore or not as she wished. Winter slowly gave way to early spring. Teresa and Dalton settled into married life, and she discovered what it meant to be partners with someone rather than property. Dalton asked her opinion on decisions about the cabin and their small savings. He encouraged her to read books he borrowed from the Diamond Creek Ranch's owner, who had an extensive library. He never raised his voice to her, never made her feel small or worthless. In turn, Teresa found herself blooming like a flower after a long frost. Her smiles came more easily. Her laughter was frequent. She began to dream again, not just of survival but of a real future. She and Dalton talked about saving money to buy their own land, starting a small horse ranch. They spoke of possibilities that felt both distant and achingly close. But the shadow of Vincent Anderson hung over everything. Teresa knew it was only a matter of time before he found her. The fear never quite left her, despite Dalton's constant reassurances. The confrontation came in late March. Teresa was alone at the cabin, preparing dinner when she heard a horse approaching. Something in the sound made her freeze, made the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. She moved to the window and looked out, then felt her entire body turn to ice. Vincent sat astride a large black horse, his face twisted with rage even from a distance. He had found her. Teresa's first instinct was to run, but there was nowhere to go. The cabin was her only shelter, and Dalton wouldn't be home for at least another hour. With shaking hands, she barred the door and reached for the rifle Dalton kept loaded above the fireplace. Vincent's fist pounded against the door hard enough to rattle the frame. "Teresa, I know you're in there. Open this door right now. Go away, Vincent." Teresa called out, trying to keep her voice steady. "I'm not coming back. You're my wife. You belong to me. What kind of ungrateful whore runs away from her husband?" Vincent's voice was thick with fury and whiskey. "I've been searching for weeks, and this is how you repay me. Hiding out here like some kind of harlot. I'm not your wife anymore. I'm married to someone else now, someone who treats me with respect." The words were braver than Teresa felt. "Married? You can't be married. You're already married to me. And when I get my hands on whoever you've been spreading your legs for, I'll kill him." Vincent slammed against the door again. "Open this door, Teresa, or I swear I'll burn this cabin to the ground." Teresa raised the rifle with trembling hands, pointing it at the door. She had never shot anyone in her life, had barely held a gun before Dalton showed her how for protection. But she knew with absolute certainty that she would pull the trigger before she let Vincent touch her again. The sound of another horse approaching made both of them freeze. Teresa's heart leapt with desperate hope. Dalton had come home early. That's far enough. Dalton's voice was hard as granite. Teresa could hear him through the cabin walls, could picture him sitting on his horse with his hand near his holstered pistol. "Step away from that door." "Who the hell are you?" Vincent demanded. "I'm Dalton Drake, and that's my wife you're harassing. I suggest you ride on out of here before this gets ugly." "Your wife? That lying bitch is married to me. She's got no right to be here, no right to be with you." Vincent's voice rose to a shout. "I'm taking her home where she belongs. She's not going anywhere with you. Teresa made her choice, and you need to respect that." There was a long moment of tense silence. Teresa moved back to the window, keeping the rifle ready, and watched the scene unfold outside. Vincent and Dalton faced each other like gunslingers in a dime novel, but there was nothing romantic about the very real danger crackling in the air. "She's my legal wife," Vincent said, his voice dropping to something more controlled and dangerous. "The law is on my side. You're harboring another man's wife, which makes you a criminal and her an adulteress. I could have you both arrested." "You could try," Dalton agreed. "But then you'd have to explain to the sheriff why your wife ran away in the middle of winter with nothing but the clothes on her back. You'd have to explain the bruises and the broken ribs. I'm guessing those are things you'd rather not have officially documented." Vincent's face flushed dark red. "I have a right to discipline my wife as I see fit. You have no rights over Teresa anymore. She's under my protection now, and I promise you this. If you try to take her, if you even think about hurting her again, it will be the last thing you ever do." Dalton's hand moved to rest on his pistol. "I don't make threats lightly, Anderson. I suggest you take me seriously." For a terrible moment, Teresa thought Vincent would draw his own gun. She held her breath, her finger resting on the rifle's trigger. But something in Dalton's steady gaze must have convinced Vincent that this was a fight he couldn't win. He spat on the ground and yanked his horse's reins. "This isn't over," Vincent snarled. "I'll go to the authorities. I'll make sure everyone knows what kind of man you are, stealing another man's wife. You'll be ruined in this territory. I'll take my chances." Dalton didn't move, didn't blink. Now get off my property before I decide you're trespassing with intent to harm." Vincent wheeled his horse around and galloped away, disappearing into the trees. But even after he was gone, Dalton remained outside for several long minutes, watching and waiting to make sure Vincent didn't double back. Finally, he dismounted and approached the cabin. "Teresa, it's safe. You can open the door." Teresa's hands were shaking so badly she could barely lift the bar. The moment the door opened, she fell into Dalton's arms, the rifle clattering to the floor. He held her tight, one hand stroking her hair while she shook with reaction. "I've got you," he murmured. "You're safe. He's gone. He'll come back. He'll go to the law like he said, and they'll make me return to him." Teresa couldn't stop the terror from flooding through her. "Dalton, I can't go back. I would rather die than go back to him." "You won't go back, I swear it." Dalton pulled away just enough to look into her eyes. "But you're right that we need to think about this carefully. Anderson might try to use the law against us, which means we need to be smart." They spent the evening discussing options, each one more difficult than the last. Teresa could try to obtain a legal divorce, but that would require returning to Salt Lake City and facing Vincent in court, with little chance of success. They could leave Utah entirely and start over somewhere else, but that would mean abandoning the life Dalton had built here. Or they could stay and fight, which carried its own risks. "What do you want to do?" Dalton asked finally. "This is your life, Teresa. You get to choose." Teresa thought about the woman she had been a few months ago, terrified and broken, believing she had no choices at all. She thought about the woman she was becoming, strong and hopeful, learning what love could be when it was freely given. She looked at Dalton, this good man who had saved her life and then showed her how to live it. "I want to stay," she said firmly. "I want to build a life here with you. I want to stop running and start fighting for what I deserve. Then that's what we'll do." Dalton took her hands. Together. The next morning, Dalton rode into Kelton and returned with the town sheriff, a weathered man named Tom Pritchard who had a reputation for fairness. Teresa was terrified to speak to him, but Dalton stayed by her side, his presence giving her courage. She told Sheriff Pritchard everything. She described the years of violence, the injuries, the fear that had driven her into the winter night. She showed him the faded bruises, the scar above her eye. She explained why she had fled and why she refused to return. Sheriff Pritchard listened carefully, his expression growing more grim as the story unfolded. "Mrs. Anderson, I won't lie to you. The law in these matters is complicated. Technically, you are still married to Vincent Anderson, and he has legal standing as your husband." Teresa's heart sank, but the sheriff held up a hand. "However, I've known men like your husband before, men who use the law as a weapon while hiding behind respectability. And I've learned to trust my instincts about people." He looked between Teresa and Dalton. "I see a woman who's been through hell and a man who's trying to do right by her. That counts for something in my book." "What are you saying, Sheriff?" Dalton asked. "I'm saying that if Vincent Anderson comes to me demanding I return his wife, I'm going to require substantial evidence of his claims. I'm going to ask him why his wife felt the need to run away. I'm going to make it as difficult as possible for him to use my office to continue his abuse." Pritchard stood and placed his hat back on his head. "I can't promise you protection from the law forever, but I can buy you some time. Use it wisely." After the sheriff left, Teresa felt a weight lift from her shoulders. They weren't safe, not completely, but they had an ally now. They had a chance. Spring blossomed into summer, and life took on a new rhythm. Dalton continued his work at Diamond Creek Ranch, but he also began making plans for their future. He negotiated with the ranch owner to buy a section of land adjacent to the cabin, with plans to start breeding horses. Teresa threw herself into helping, her natural intelligence and quick learning making her invaluable as a partner in the venture. The community slowly came to accept them as a married couple. There were whispers, of course, especially when word spread that Teresa had left a previous husband. But Dalton's steady reputation and Teresa's obvious happiness went a long way towards smoothing over the scandal. The ranch owner's wife, Martha Donovan, became a particular friend to Teresa, providing both companionship and a buffer against the worst of the gossip. Vincent made 2 more attempts to reclaim Teresa. The first time, he tried to ambush her while she was in town buying supplies, but Martha Donovan and several other women intervened, making such a scene that Vincent retreated in humiliation. The second time, he attempted to file formal charges against Dalton for alienation of affection, but Sheriff Pritchard buried the paperwork and suggested Vincent might want to consider his own legal exposure for assault. After that, Vincent seemed to disappear. Rumors suggested he had moved to Wyoming, while others claimed he had simply given up and taken to drinking full-time. Teresa didn't care as long as he stayed away from her and Dalton. As summer turned to autumn, Teresa realized she was pregnant. The discovery filled her with a complex mix of emotions. Joy that she was carrying Dalton's child, the physical proof of their love. Fear that somehow Vincent would find out and use it against them. Worry about bringing a child into their uncertain situation. She told Dalton one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sun set over the mountains. His reaction was everything she could have hoped for. He pulled her into his arms with tears streaming down his face, laughing and murmuring words of love and amazement. "We're going to have a baby," he kept repeating as though he couldn't quite believe it. "Teresa, you've made me the happiest man alive. You're not worried about the complications with Vincent, about what people might say." "I don't give a damn what people say, and Vincent Anderson can rot in hell for all I care. This baby is ours, yours and mine, and nothing can change that." Dalton placed his hand gently on her still flat stomach. "This is our future, Teresa, our family." The pregnancy progressed smoothly through the winter. Teresa bloomed with health, her body taking to motherhood naturally. Dalton was attentive and protective without being smothering, building a cradle with his own hands and making plans to expand the cabin to accommodate their growing family. They received word in February that Vincent had died in a saloon fight in Cheyenne. Sheriff Pritchard rode out personally to deliver the news, along with a copy of the death certificate. Teresa's first emotion was relief so profound it made her knees weak. The shadow that had hung over her life was finally, completely gone. "You're free now," Dalton said that night, holding her close. "Truly free." "I've been free since the night you found me," Teresa replied, but she understood what he meant. The legal complications, the lingering fear, all of it was resolved. "Does this mean we should get married again, properly this time?" "I'd marry you every day for the rest of my life if I could." Dalton kissed her gently. "But yes, let's make it legal. I want our child to have no questions about their legitimacy." They were remarried in early March in a small ceremony at the church in Kelton, with Martha and her husband standing as witnesses and half the town in attendance. This time, Teresa wore a new dress that Martha had helped her sew, one that accommodated her growing belly. This time, when she said her vows, there was no fear, no secret shame, only joy and love and the promise of a future built on trust. Their son was born in late April during a spring rainstorm. Dalton delivered the baby himself with Martha's assistance, and when he placed the squalling infant in Teresa's arms, she understood for the first time what it meant to have a family. They named him Daniel Thomas Drake, carrying on both their initials in a small private joke. The years that followed were not without challenges. Building a horse ranch from scratch was grueling work, and there were lean times when they worried about making it through the winter. But they faced everything together, partners in every sense of the word. Teresa proved to have a natural gift for working with horses, especially the difficult ones that others had given up on. Dalton's skill as a breeder combined with Teresa's training methods made their ranch a success. They had 2 more children over the next 5 years. A daughter they named Mary, who had her mother's determination and her father's steady nature. Then another son called William, who was fearless and wild from the moment he could walk. The cabin was expanded twice to accommodate their growing family, eventually becoming a proper ranch house. Teresa never forgot what her life had been like before Dalton found her in the snow. The memories served as a reminder of how far she had come, how much she had survived, but they no longer defined her. She was no longer Vincent Anderson's victim. She was Teresa Drake, horse trainer, mother, beloved wife. She was free. On their 10th anniversary, Dalton surprised her by recreating their first meeting. He took her riding into the mountains on a crisp January evening, back to the grove of pine trees where he had found her. But instead of snow and blood and terror, there was a blanket spread under the stars with a picnic supper and a bottle of wine. "You remember what I said to you that night?" Dalton asked, pulling Teresa into his arms. "You said he would never hurt me again." Teresa smiled up at him. "You kept that promise. I'll keep on keeping it for the rest of my life." Dalton kissed her, slow and deep and full of the love they had built together. "You saved me too, you know. I was just existing before you came into my life. You taught me what it means to really live." "We saved each other," Teresa said softly. "That's what love is supposed to do." They stayed on the mountain long into the night, talking and laughing and holding each other under the vast expanse of stars. Below them, lights glowed in the windows of their ranch house where their children slept safely. Around them, the Utah wilderness stretched wild and beautiful, the same wilderness that had nearly claimed Teresa's life, but instead became the foundation of her future. The years continued to unfold with all their complications and joys. Daniel grew into a strong young man who shared his father's love of horses and his mother's gift for training them. Mary became a teacher, fulfilling the dream Teresa had once held for herself. William followed his own path, becoming a sheriff like Tom Pritchard, and carrying on the legacy of protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. Dalton and Teresa grew old together, their love deepening with each passing year. The passion of their early days mellowed into something even more profound, a partnership of souls that needed no words. They faced illness and loss, celebrated births and marriages, and built a legacy that extended far beyond their ranch. On a warm summer evening in 1925, 43 years after their first meeting, Dalton and Teresa sat on the porch of their ranch house surrounded by their children and grandchildren. The ranch had prospered beyond their wildest dreams, becoming one of the most respected horse breeding operations in Utah. But more importantly, it had become a home filled with love and laughter, a place where fear had no power and safety was absolute. "Tell us the story again, Grandma," one of the grandchildren pleaded. "Tell us how you and Grandpa met." Teresa looked at Dalton, who smiled and took her hand. Even after all these years, his touch still made her feel safe and cherished. She began to speak, her voice steady and sure. "It was the winter of 1882, and I was running through the snow with no hope left in my heart. I thought my life was over, that I had nowhere to turn and no future to claim. But then a cowboy found me and made me a promise. He said the man who hurt me would never hurt me again. And he kept that promise, but he did so much more than that. He showed me what love really means. He gave me a family, a home, and a life worth living." She squeezed Dalton's hand and felt him squeeze back. I was fleeing one man in the winter when another man found me and changed everything. He saved my life, and then he gave me reasons to live it. And that, my darlings, is the greatest love story I know. The grandchildren sighed happily, satisfied with the tale they had heard many times before but never tired of. As the sun set over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Dalton pulled Teresa closer. "I love you," he murmured into her hair. "From that first night until my last breath I will love you." "And I love you," Teresa replied. "My cowboy, my rescuer, my home." They had built something beautiful together from the ashes of Teresa's former life. They had created a family rooted in respect and nurtured by genuine affection. They had proven that love could heal even the deepest wounds, that courage could be found in the darkest moments, and that sometimes salvation came in the form of a stranger on horseback, willing to stand between you and harm. The ranch continued for generations, each child and grandchild carrying forward the values Dalton and Teresa had instilled. The story of their meeting became family legend, told and retold to remind everyone that no matter how desperate circumstances might seem, there is always hope. There is always the possibility of rescue, of redemption, of love finding you when you least expect it. Dalton passed away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 89, with Teresa holding his hand and their entire family gathered around. Teresa followed him just 3 months later, unable or unwilling to exist in a world without her partner. They were buried side by side on a hill overlooking their ranch, under a grove of pine trees that reminded everyone of where their story began. Their legacy lived on in the ranch, in their descendants, and in the countless lives they had touched over the years. Teresa had become known for taking in women who needed shelter, offering them the same safety and new beginning that Dalton had once offered her. Dalton had mentored dozens of young men in the art of ranching, teaching them that strength and gentleness were not opposites but complements. The cabin where they first lived together was preserved as part of the ranch, a monument to new beginnings. Inside, the simple furniture and few possessions told a story of survival and hope. The bed where Teresa had first slept safely, the fireplace where they had shared their first real conversation, the doorway where Dalton had stood facing down Vincent Anderson, promising protection he had never failed to provide. In the end, their story was simple but profound. A woman fleeing for her life in the bitter winter of Utah. A cowboy who found her and made a promise. And a love that grew from that promise, transforming two lonely people into a family, a ranch, and a legacy that would endure for generations. The words Dalton had spoken that first night became the foundation of everything that followed. "He'll never hurt you again." It was more than a promise of protection. It was a vow to show Teresa what love should look like, to give her a life without fear, to stand beside her through every challenge and triumph. And he had kept that vow every single day for the rest of his life. Teresa had found in Dalton everything she had never known to dream of. Not just safety, but partnership. Not just shelter, but home. Not just protection, but love that honored and uplifted her. She had entered his life broken and desperate, and he had helped her become whole and strong. Together, they had proven that the past does not have to define the future, that courage can be found when it is needed most, and that true love is not about possession, but about mutual respect and unwavering support. They had shown that sometimes the greatest love stories begin in the darkest moments, when one person extends a hand, and another person finds the courage to take it. Their story became a beacon for others, a reminder that healing is possible, that new beginnings can emerge from endings, and that love, when it is real and true, has the power to transform everything. The Wild West might have been harsh and unforgiving, but it was also a place where people could reinvent themselves, where the past could be left behind, and where two souls could find each other against all odds. Daniel Thomas Drake, their eldest son, often said that his parents' love story taught him the most important lesson of his life. That real strength is measured not by the ability to dominate, but by the willingness to protect, to nurture, and to love unconditionally. He passed this lesson to his own children, who passed it to theirs, creating a family culture built on the values Dalton and Teresa embodied. The ranch prospered through economic downturns and personal losses because it was built on a foundation of love rather than merely business. When neighbors faced hardship, the Drake family remembered how Dalton had once helped a stranger in desperate need, and they extended the same generosity. When women in the community faced violence or abandonment, they knew they could turn to the Drake Ranch for assistance, just as Teresa had once turned to Dalton. This ripple effect of compassion and courage spread throughout the region, changing countless lives in ways both large and small. The story of the woman fleeing through the winter snow and the cowboy who saved her became more than just family history. It became a parable about the importance of standing up for those who cannot stand up for themselves, about the transformative power of genuine kindness, and about the way one moment of bravery can echo through generations. As the 20th century progressed, and the Wild West became memory rather than reality, the Drake Ranch stood as a living connection to that earlier time. But it represented not the violence and lawlessness often associated with the frontier, but rather the capacity for human goodness even in harsh circumstances. It showed that the West was not just about cowboys and outlaws, but about ordinary people making extraordinary choices, about survival and hope and love finding a way. Teresa's story, in particular, resonated with women who found themselves trapped in similar circumstances. While divorce became gradually more accessible and domestic violence slowly began to be recognized as a social issue rather than a private matter, Teresa's courage in fleeing and Dalton's integrity in protecting her provided inspiration. They had found a way forward when the law offered no help, when society blamed victims, and when conventional wisdom said women had no choices. The love they built together was a testament to what relationships could be when founded on equality and mutual respect. In an era when women had few rights and marriage often meant subjugation, Dalton and Teresa created a partnership where her voice mattered equally, where her dreams were valued, and where her autonomy was respected. This was revolutionary in its own quiet way, a model that influenced how their children and grandchildren approached their own relationships. The ranch itself became a symbol of this egalitarian approach. While Dalton handled the physical demands of breeding and training, Teresa managed the business side with skill that would have surprised those who believed women incapable of such work. She kept the books, negotiated contracts, and built relationships with buyers across the western states. Together, they proved that men and women could be true partners, each contributing their strengths to create something neither could have achieved alone. In the final analysis, the story of Dalton Drake and Teresa Anderson Drake was about transformation. Teresa transformed from a victim into a survivor, and finally into a woman who helped other victims survive. Dalton transformed from a solitary cowboy into a devoted husband, father, and pillar of his community. Together, they transformed a simple cabin into a thriving ranch, a chance encounter into a legendary love story, and their own pain into a legacy of compassion. Their story proved that love, real love, is not about grand gestures or perfect circumstances. It is about choosing to protect and cherish another person every single day. It is about keeping promises even when doing so is difficult. It is about creating safety where there was danger, building hope where there was despair, and nurturing growth where there was trauma. As the generations passed, and the original participants in this story faded into history, the essence remained. The promise Dalton made in the winter of 1882, "He'll never hurt you again," became more than words. It became a philosophy, a commitment, a way of being in the world. It reminded everyone who heard the story that we all have the power to be someone's rescuer, to stand between the vulnerable and harm, to offer shelter to those fleeing danger. And so the story ends where it began, in those Utah mountains during a harsh winter. But what seemed like an ending that night, when Teresa collapsed in the snow, proved to be a beginning. The beginning of a love story that would span decades, influence generations, and remind countless people that sometimes salvation comes when you least expect it, in the form of a stranger willing to make a promise and keep it, no matter what. Dalton Drake found Teresa Anderson in the winter of 1882 and changed both their lives forever. He promised she would never be hurt again, and in keeping that promise, he gave her everything she had never dared to dream of: safety, partnership, family, and a love that would last until their final breaths and beyond, living on in the hearts of everyone they touched.